All right.
All right, so Dr. Neighbors, it's very nice to have you here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Over the years, I've heard a lot about you and your work, and so we're here today to kind of try to get as much of that information from you as possible.
Okay.
We're just going to move through these questions, but at any time that you feel like there's something relevant to the questions, then just go ahead and let us have it.
Okay.
And we'll move forward like that. So I guess the first question is really, how did you first become involved with the PRBA? And, you know, so who, what, when, where?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it really goes all the way back to the mid-1970s.
Okay.
I came here to Ann Arbor in 1975 to work on a PhD in social psychology. And James Jackson was assigned as my academic advisor. So at the time, I had no idea that he had this crazy idea to do a national survey of Black Americans. But I was hanging out with James, which put me in the ISR, Institute for Social Research environment. And that was when you know, over time I met Belinda Tucker, Phil Bowman, folks like that. So they, you know, as we move along, they will become integral part of the study. And I hope you'll have a chance to interview them as well, because they really know the story.
Absolutely, plan on it.
Yeah. But you know, I came here as a doctoral student, social psych. And so the first couple of years, you know, I was just trying to get my coursework done, just figure out what this whole PhD process was about. I was very young, came right out of undergraduate school. And so once I figured out that working on a doctorate was really not exactly the same as working on a bachelor's degree. I told you I was very young. You know, I thought I'd come here and do the coursework, you know, but I said, wow, this PhD thing is really very different. And so I need to make sure I know exactly why I want a PhD, because if I don't have that answer, then I need to move on and do something else. So I took a leave of absence from the doctoral program and got a job with the local community mental health center. So I was working in research and evaluation in community mental health, and that put me smack dab in the middle of a whole bunch of very interesting mental health projects, community mental health needs assessments, which I won't go into that, but that's a little tangential, but it links up, you know, to the concept of doing a national survey of mental health needs, which is eventually, you know, where I ended up when I decided I did want to come back to the doctoral program, because I knew exactly what I wanted to do. So one day I'm sitting at my desk at the mental health center, and I get a call from Belinda Tucker, and she basically said, you know, hey, it's Belinda, and we're working on this proposal, mental health of Black folks. And she said something to the effect of, and I hear you're a mental health expert or something like that. You know, I'm like, really? You know, I work at a mental health center. That's about it. You know, but I had along the way picked up, you know, a little bit of knowledge about the challenges and difficulties of assessing mental health status using various methodologies. You know, questionnaires, interviews, self-report. Clinical judgment. I mean, all the basics.
The center that you were working at, was it located in a Black community? Or
No.
Was it? Okay.
No, it was not. It was here in Washtenaw County.
Okay.
But I guess my point is that the methods and procedures that I was being exposed to for the first time would come in handy when that time came for us to try to figure out how we were going to go into Black communities and ask questions about mental health.
Got it.
So that it was really my you know, connection with James Jackson, and then getting to know Belinda, Phil, and all those folks, including Jerry Gurin was another big name. And again, I hope you are going to be interviewing Jerry, because you know, he wrote the classic text, Americans View Their Mental Health, that I studied quite a bit. So I joined the proposal writing team for the National Survey of Black Americans, and connected with Belinda and Phil around the idea of the assessment of mental health.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So in 75 you started in graduate school. What year did you come back in the fold? So the proposal writing process started about 77 or 70?
Yeah, my recollection, it was, 77. So I was in school from 75 to 76, and then I took my leave of absence probably from 76 to 77. So it really was, the National Survey of Black Americans, that idea was extremely attractive. So that kind of clinched the deal for me. But then stepping away for a year and just kind of thinking about life and, personal goals also helped me figure out, like, where does this PhD process fit into my overall program. And so the bottom line is I was coming back anyway, whether there was an NSBA or not, because I realized that I was very interested in research. This whole notion of the investigation was just very interesting to me. And I didn't mind reading. So, reading on topics that are not only interesting to me, but are not quite answered. The more you read, the more you identify the gaps in the literature, and then you start seeing, maybe I could plug a little gap here, a little gap there. So it really all came together for me in a very nice way, and I returned to school with a sense of purpose. And from that point on, I felt I was on my direction. And so I finished up my PhD in 1982. But there's a lot that happened between 77 and 82.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So relatedly, what was your first role? Because in the 77, there was no PRBA.
No, there was not.
A collection of people working on a proposal to do a national study.
Right.
What are the kinds of things that you recall working on as that proposal took shape before you got into the field?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I remember is the standard kind of literature review. Being the grad student who was trying to do some of the heavy lifting, collecting articles, reading, just trying to get a handle on what are the methodological approaches out there to community assessment of mental health. So that's one thing I did quite a bit of. Lots of conversations and just kind of going around campus talking to people. Just felt very fortunate to be able to sit down with a person like Jerry Gurin and ask him about, his classic textbook. One of his co-authors, Joe Viroff, was also around. The mental health center where I was working was actually doing a pilot study of the replication of Americans' view of their mental health. So, I was able to access, those folks. Another guy who was around at that time was Dick Kalka, worked with him. So I was basically, I guess some people might call it being a gopher, but for me, if this is what being a gopher is, it's a damn good job.
Absolutely.
Because I was collecting articles, reading them, summarizing them for the big PIs. And in the process was learning a lot myself. So I just felt like, man, what a break.
So now, if we go, so did you have any particular role in the actual study itself? So for example, so after the proposal takes shape and it's funded and people are figuring out, what questions they're going to ask and how are they going to get into the field, sort of what roles did you play at that point?
Yeah, so one of the things that was just really fascinating and also just kind of crazy when I look back at it was that I actually was allowed to sit at the table and try to work out, how we might ask some of the questions that we ended up asking. So I guess you would say questionnaire construction. And so basically the section I worked on ended up being nicknamed Section F.
Okay.
And my name became associated with Section F because it was literally Section F in the NSBA questionnaire.
Okay.
But that was the section where we asked people to tell us what they did in response to what we called serious personal problems. So that was one doorway through which we walked the mental health construct, serious personal problems. So that was one thing. The second thing was that I was very, very much interested in the way Jerry Gurin had approached this in Americans View Their Mental Health, and he had something called the Readiness for Self-Referral Index. And so if you look at the Section F of the National Survey of Black Americans, and if you trace it back, it's essentially a modification of the Gurin self-referral index that he used in his classic study, and then which was used again in the replication, which was called the Survey of Modern Living. The other place where I was involved was, and I'm not sure a lot of people know about this. It'll be interesting to look at the tapes of what you compile. And by the way, I have to say I'm so glad you're doing this.
Oh, absolutely.
Because off and on throughout my career, I have wanted to just videotape everybody, and primarily James Jackson. And in my younger days, I used to ask him, when can I get you in front of the camera? But he wouldn't stay still long enough.
Action Jackson.
Action Jackson. So it never happened.
Right, sure.
So this is really like a dream come true for me. But a lot of people may not know, primarily because the national survey, the questionnaire, the instrument gets so much attention, that we did a whole bunch of work, preliminary work up front, in what would now be called, qualitative studies to gather information about how to actually develop the questionnaire. So I was able to help with the focus groups that were done prior to the actual questionnaire development around various constructs. Again, let me just wrap this up. I think today, this would be labeled as a culturally grounded approach.
That's what I'm trying to.
Yeah.
So was this, to your knowledge, for example, were you reading things that were helping to inform your decision-making process during that early construction stage? Or were you guys just sort of doing what made sense to you guys in order to get a good survey?
Well, I'd really say both. We were all reading, and certainly I was reading because I was a student, and I didn't know nearly as much as I wanted to know about all this stuff. So I was reading, and I was writing, because I had academic products. Certainly James, Belinda, all of us were reading and doing our homework, but we were also doing the other thing. It's like, what makes sense from the information that we were gathering from the qualitative data collection we were doing up front. So, my guess, and you can check this out, is that the mastermind behind that procedure was James, and then, we, different people put that into action. And so I got a chance to be a part of some of the focus groups. And I believe we ran focus groups in one northern urban setting and one southern setting. So you have to check on this, but I believe it was probably Detroit and Alabama, something like that. So for me, I was really working on the problem of, can you talk about mental health with black folks in this kind of face-to-face interview setting? Because we all know there's a lot of stigma around, all things mental health. And if you were going to talk about it, how would you talk about it? And more importantly, how would you have confidence that the words you're using, the stimuli, are actually understandable to the respondent? So if you went in and started asking people questions about depression or even mental health, no one was really sure whether what I was saying was exactly what the person was hearing. And so we saw the qualitative methodology as a way of getting into that. So our qualitative approach was very open-ended. We had some basic phrases that we were thinking about using in the questionnaire, but we wanted to get feedback from people. So when you say mental health, what does that mean to you? What words come to mind? All of this was information that we later gleaned, went through and started crafting some of the questionnaires. Long story short, in the National Survey of Black Americans, Section F, we concluded that the terminology of nerves, nervousness, and especially nervous breakdown was something that almost any black person was a phrase that we used and we understood, and it would have meaning in a survey setting. And the way we discovered the meaning of that is by doing a fair number of focus groups and getting people to talk to us about nervous breakdown. I think every one of us has stories in our family. I'm sure your parents probably told you at one point, maybe more than one point, that you were about to drive them to a point of a nervous breakdown.
Yes.
Or my mom said, "Boy, you're about to give me a nervous breakdown."
That's right.
And as a youngster, I wasn't sure exactly what that was, but I knew it wasn't good. It was a sign to me that I better stop doing what I'm doing. And also the phrase we would use quite a bit is, you're getting on my nerves, or you're getting on my last nerve. So we found that just by asking people about mental health, they almost very quickly would transition into this language of nerves, nervousness. Now you have to understand, this is quite a while ago. This is the mid-'70s. So this is before DSM-3 and the revolution that sparked in terms of how we all talk about mental health and mental illness today. This, I don't want to go too far off track, but today, we're used to hearing lots of phrases like people just say PTSD, bipolar, it rolls off their tongue like, oh yeah, everybody knows what I'm talking about. In the 70s, no. In fact, there was no DSM-3. In fact, in my job at the Community Mental Health Center, I actually once saw a copy of DSM-2 sitting on the shelf, and it was about that thick.
Yeah.
And I didn't even have the sense to grab it and open it because I hadn't evolved to that point yet in my own work. So the bottom line is we came up with, for Section F, to get people into the mental health part of the questionnaire by asking them if they'd ever been at the point of a nervous breakdown. And if so, we asked a whole series of questions about how did you respond, what did you do? And so in those days, that was my first introduction to the stress and coping literature. So for me, mental health was really all about stress and adaptation. That was my conceptualization of mental health. And in the black community, the most comfortable phrase that tapped into the idea that at times in our lives we can become overwhelmed with the demands of living, and that phrase was nervous breakdown. Yeah. And so, and we've replicated this in subsequent studies, that in the black communities, a lot of times there's like a double meaning with stuff. So nervous breakdown can be that kind of funny phrase that our parents would use. By the way, I once tried to tell my mom and dad that they were about to drive me to a nervous breakdown.
That didn't work.
That definitely didn't. I never brought that one up. I thought, hey, let me try it. Maybe I can get out of doing some stuff. So it can be used in that way. But we discovered through an empirical, investigation that nervous breakdown also had a very clear and serious meaning relevant to one's emotional well-being. and that a nervous breakdown was akin in the black community to something like a transient situational disturbance or a human adjustment problem. Mm-hmm. So they weren't saying you were mentally ill and crazy, mm-hmm. which I found out later. Crazy is another one of those words. Mm-hmm. Oh, you so crazy,
right?
Or, man, that dude is crazy, meaning psychotic. Mm-hmm. Or more importantly, I don't want people to think I'm crazy, which is the whole stigma thing, which we haven't talked about, but it's sort of underlying a lot of this. So crazy is a word like that. Nervous breakdown is a word like that, but we tapped into the sort of serious meaning of a nervous breakdown, stress. Maybe today we might say stressed out. Mm-hmm. But through bringing your resources, your coping strategies, your coping resources, your resilience to bear on the problem, a person who's at the point of a nervous breakdown can come back from that, can bounce back mm-hmm. from that. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it was just perfect because my reading had led me to the concept of a stressful episode, which is mm-hmm. what I was interested in. That mental health for me was about stress and coping, and these stressful episodes that people had in their lives brought whatever resources to bear and then tried to get back into a steady state.
So thinking back to that time when you've done reading, you've spent some time in the community, you've come back and done reading, you begin to work with these folks who are putting together a proposal. Mm-hmm. The proposal gets funded. You're in the field doing these focus groups. You're learning about these key terms and maybe how to introduce this conversation in the field.
Yep.
What were some of the challenges that you encountered personally in this context, though, and how did you address some of those challenges?
Challenges personally.
I mean, when I say personally, kind of broadly speaking, but also kind of, were there points when you reached your limit and you were reaching that kind of stressed out moment? Mm-hmm. And what were the things that you drew upon to mm-hmm. continue to work, and how did you address mm-hmm. Any kind of challenges?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I'd have to say that, during those years, I didn't feel particularly stressed or overwhelmed, mm-hmm. even though when I look back on what I was doing, I don't know why I wasn't, right. But I think you can probably relate to this when you're a young man.
You just don't know any better.
Yeah, when you're a very young man and you do feel like you have a plan mm-hmm. and you are confident, even though you're probably overconfident, and I think mm-hmm. that was the case with me. I was overconfident, mm-hmm. But I was in my early 20s. Mm-hmm. So in those days, I kind of felt there's nothing I can't do without a plan, and always had a plan. Looking back on it, though, it wasn't a smooth sailing, and I think the main thing that was a challenge for me is the kind of thing that's a challenge for a lot of folks, and that's balancing the tremendous demands of academic life and getting through a doctoral program with family life. Mm. So I was so crazy that, I got married in the first year of my PhD program.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. The thought of starting a doctoral program, getting married, and then very quickly I wanted to start my family. So, by 76, I had my daughter was born, Camila. And, so I was doing all of this doctoral stuff while I was, getting the family going and trying to figure out marriage and all that and being a father. And it was a lot on my plate. It was a lot to do. And again, I don't want to even suggest that it was all smooth sailing.
Sure.
But, my attitude was there isn't a problem here that can't be solved. So I never felt I got, to my own point of a nervous breakdown during those days.
Sure. So thinking during that period, I can just imagine the frenzy of excitement around doing this project and things. And so there's probably a lot of different moments that were really special moments that you can think of. But if you could share a couple of those moments where you felt particularly, satisfied, accomplished, like you had contributed something, you had learned something new, those kinds of moments in that period between, say, 75 and after the survey's been collected and such.
Yeah. Before I answer that, though, I'm still kind of locked in on your early question.
Sure.
And it would be interesting for me to go back later today and have a conversation with my wife, because we're still married, so I can check this out.
Yeah.
But again, me being the kind of guy I was, just sort of doing my thing, I often wonder whether I was so laser focused on, my doctoral program that I was checking in with her to see what it was like to be the spouse of a PhD student who's got all these crazy hours, and she's not only a new wife but a new mom, and she had this baby that she was taking care of. Plus, she had her own education. She's a Bryn Mawr graduate. I went to Haverford. She went to Bryn Mawr, and I know her parents were kind of looking at this and going, because I don't think this was the sequence of events that they were thinking about. And I think so I wonder whether or not that was, kind of a stressful thing for her, because, being highly educated and not working for a while. And I do remember for a while there, all her classmates from Bryn Mawr, who, just for the audience, I think everybody knows Bryn Mawr is a women's institution, so all her Bryn Mawr classmates were female. They were in law school, medical school, starting their careers. And I think that created some dissonance for her at that time. Fast forward, the way things worked out, and once I finished up my PhD, somewhere in there we had a second child, and then it was her turn to go to school. And so she eventually went to dental school, and then I became the primary child rearer person, sometimes called Mr. Mom. So I inherited a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, while my wife, got her dental degree. So over time, it worked out. But I wonder in those early days what it was like for her. But for me, you're right. It was like really exciting. Not only having my plan, but also just feeling like, man, I'm catching all these lucky breaks. This James Jackson guy is doing this national survey right at the time that I just happened to show up, and it's just really exciting. Yeah. So what was your question again?
Yeah. So I'm just thinking about, there must have been a lot of exciting moments. I can imagine, moments when you might have been just either sitting in the library and realized what you were doing, or were out doing the focus groups and realized what you were doing.
Yeah. Like, there were a lot of those, but the story that's kind of uppermost on my mind right now, because I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, because as I told you earlier, Sherman James had a retirement symposium last week, so I went in to make some remarks. And the remarks I made partially focused on the early days of the National Survey of Black Americans. And again, I'm not sure that a lot of people know. I know most of the audience I spoke to last week down at Duke did not know that the National Survey of Black Americans put together a national advisory board of black social scientists.
And what year was the first board composed? Do you know?
Well, I'm going to roughly guess it must have been 1978, but you'll have to check the documents.
Sure.
And I do remember there was an advisory board meeting in Ann Arbor, and that's one of the big highlights for me. Because again, I'm just this little grad student, I don't know what I'm doing, but I know I'm doing something. And then all these folks just come in from all over the country, and we had this big meeting. And a lot of stuff got worked up. A lot of stuff got discussed. But I'll never forget the day that James, was telling us that this meeting's going to happen, and he was running down the lineup of folks who were coming in. And I can't remember everybody, but I'm sure A.J. Franklin was one of the folks. But I distinctly remember him saying, and we got this dynamite brother, this dynamite epidemiologist from UNC Chapel Hill coming in, Sherman James. And I'm like, whoa. Now I'd never heard of Sherman James, because this was Sherman James before he was Sherman James. He was well on his way to becoming Sherman James. But the key word for me was, we have this dynamite black epidemiologist, because my studies had taken me from social psychology to community psychology to community mental health to public health, and then anchored in psychiatric epidemiology. So by then, I knew that I had to come to grips with whatever this field of epidemiology was. And in fact, when you interview Phil Bowman, ask him about the days I would come into his office pulling my hair out like, Phil, I was having an identity crisis. It's like, Phil, what am I? Am I a social psychologist? Am I an epidemiologist? Like, I'm trying to work this stuff out. So I couldn't wait to meet Sherman James, the epidemiologist, because, I'm saying, hey, I got to sit next to this guy at lunch, and I've got to find out everything I can find out about epidemiology, because, this is what I'm into, and I think this is, part of my calling. So, when Sherman showed up, and, again, I could go on and on and on, but I won't in the interest of time, but I did get a chance to meet him. And when I was obviously nervous and a little intimidated because his reputation preceded him. And when I found out what a down-to-earth, decent human being he was, and that I immediately felt very comfortable, and that he was just very open to having all kinds of conversations. That was a big highlight for me in my career. And in fact, that first meeting, we talked about the challenges of fatherhood, because he had young children. And we didn't really, I wanted to ask him all about the technical aspects of epidemiology, but he wanted to talk to me about, what's it like being a father. And I was just sitting there going, wow, this guy actually is interested in me, even though he's, in some ways the man. So that was a big deal. I do have one other quick story I'll tell you about that day, is that when we were doing the more formal part of the program, and we were, having each advisor go around and say who they were. When they got to Sherman, Sherman says, yeah, I'm Sherman James, UNC Chapel Hill, Department of Epidemiology. And then he says, but I can't really do a good Sherman, but he's a real serious cat, He said, what I really want to know is how the National Survey of Black Americans plans to calculate the true prevalence of mental illness in black communities. That's my question.
It's a pretty big question.
Yeah, so I'm like, so I just remember the room kind of going silent for a little while. And, I think James looked at Phil looked at Belinda, I looked at Jerry, Belinda looked at me, I looked down at the table, and so I'll always remember that question, because it was simple on its surface, but it was incredibly complicated once you dug into it, because in some ways that was the question. Now, we went on to solve that question partially by all the stuff I told you previously about the nervous breakdown and Section F, but Sherman was also foregrounding for us, as an epidemiologist, what lay ahead in terms of the post-1980 proliferation of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical manual, which sometimes, I refer to, I guess a lot of people refer to as the sort of Bible of the American Psychiatric Association. So I think we always have to keep in mind when we're talking about the history of the National Survey of Black Americans, we're talking about the mid to late 1970s. That's a long time ago. And we were doing this work prior to a lot of the methodological and conceptual revolutions that were going to happen. And one place I really mark it is, the publication of DSM-3. You remember I told you I saw DSM-2 and it was about like that. DSM-3 was
bigger. And
then 3R, 4, 4TR, and now 5. I mean, 5 is, so you've got that whole thing that hadn't even begun yet. But interestingly, in the same way that we were working things out on our side of the research equation, which again comes more out of the Jerry Gurin, Joe Viroff, Sheila Feld school of thought about, help seeking and coping with personal distress. There was another track that was working and that eventually would lead to a very different way of doing psychiatric epidemiology, the epidemiologic catchment area program, which again I think is too far off track for this interview, but it's another tradition of research which, depending on how far we go down this road, we'll see these two streams kind of merge.
Yes.
With the National Survey of American Life. But in those days of the 70s, these worlds were much farther apart. But to me, the question that Sherman asked was really foregrounding some of the serious challenges we were going to have to grapple with as we kept moving along. Just the concept of true prevalence.
Right.
And I only knew what prevalence was because I had done a little bit of reading, but maybe if he'd asked that question 2 or 3 weeks ago, I'd have been going, prevalence? What? Yeah. So one of the things I say to Sherman, because basically his question is a question that we're still working on today. And so what is this, 2014. So, all these years later, we know a lot more about how to do that, but we still don't totally have it figured out. So sometimes I jokingly say to Sherman, like, thanks for a career-setting question.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. So that first advisory panel meeting was just a big highlight.
Yeah. So we don't really, we haven't really established a clear order, so I'm going to hop around here a little bit.
Okay.
So as the NSBA kind of solidifies, at some point we develop a sense of this thing called the Program for Research on Black Americans.
Right.
So as that thing began to coalesce, what was your early vision of what did that mean to you? What did you think it was about, et cetera?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So for me, this was about helping with the National Survey of Black Americans. Because what did I know? I'm barely figuring out this thing called the proposal. Because until I came to U of M, didn't have to write any proposals to get money to do stuff. When I did my senior thesis back at Haverford College, it was just me, running around, asking people my little survey questions. And so fairly soon after the National Survey of Black Americans, the group started working on the three-generational proposal. Because of my interests, I didn't have as much to do with that one, but I helped out, And that's when it finally clicked to me that part of what being successful in academia is about is getting a team together, a group of folks who have some shared vision and can get along with each other, and then it's a collective, I think a lot of people think of academia as a very individualistic thing, and many parts of it are, but in those early days, we were introduced to this concept of a team, which eventually became a program. And a program is something very explicit, within the bureaucratic structure. But a team is something that everybody can relate to. And if somebody on the team was getting ready to do something, which mostly it's write a proposal, then everybody else on the team, it was understood that you would show up, jump in, and help out, even if you weren't really on that particular proposal.
Do you remember a conversation that put everybody on the same page, or did you guys just begin to kind of...
I don't really remember a big conversation about that. It would be interesting to see if one happened, but I remember a conversation with Belinda, one-on-one. She was the one that kind of helped me grow in terms of my identity and my consciousness about this. And it wasn't a big deal conversation, but I just remember, one day just really being wiped out. I don't even know what I was doing, but, Belinda called, said, hey, we're getting together over at ISAR to do X, Y, and Z. And I was like, oh man, I'm just not feeling it today. I think I tried to halfway beg out of it. And she just kind of said, nah, we really need you, because we're doing this thing. And, having played sports all my life, the concept of the team was very high on my value list. So, it didn't take much convincing. I just had to make the connection that, oh, this is the same thing I've always experienced. You get a group of people together who have a shared vision and a shared commitment, and people laugh at this thing we say, there's no I in team, but if you've played sports and you've been on a team, you know that when it's really working right, there's really no I in team. You submerge your ego, your personal needs for this greater good. And it was just that little conversation with Belinda helped me see, this NSBA thing it's a team, and it's not just about the National Survey of Black Americans, it's about the future and what are we going to do? And so at some point it became clear to me that what we were going to do was create a program for research on Black Americans. And again, I never really got James to break it down for me, all the nuts and bolts of where that came from in his head and what conversation. I mean, that's what's going to be so great about all your video. You're going to get all this stuff. Like there's a rich oral history in our heads, so even though it's an oral history, a lot of it isn't even oral yet, because everybody's so busy trying to survive and doing what they do. It's only during the occasional break when you slow down that this stuff starts coming out. So the other thing that became quickly apparent was that a program, particularly in 1977, 78, 79, at a predominantly white institution like the University of Michigan, a program that was dedicated to research on Black Americans was not only a team, but it was also a home. It could be a home. It could be a comfortable space, place, just to congregate, hang out, share information. And so that's what evolved over that time, from the 70s into the 80s. And it's amazing to me we still have PRBA today.
Right. So thinking back, so that particular period of time to me is a really interesting time. So as you continue to think through that, as we continue to talk, if you ever want to jump back to that time, and as things kind of move around in your head, but at a certain time you become director of the PRBA, this place that you kind of got roped into at a certain point in your career, and you become director. But between the NSBA and you becoming director, what were some of the major milestones that you remember, some of the major moments that you recall between those two periods? Yeah.
Well, the first thing I'll say is that I never really felt roped in to it. I mean, my participation I always felt was initially a lucky break of just, being hooked up with an advisor who had this vision and hanging out. But then as I saw what was taking place, my continued involvement and participation was completely and totally voluntary. Like nobody had to rope me into anything. So I just want to be clear that there was a strong attraction to it, and there were some times when I spent, as much time at ISR as I spent in my home department. When I eventually got on tenure track. So between that time and the early part of the 2000s, some significant things. I guess for me, one of the big things was the training that we did. So when the National Survey of Black Americans was going into the field, very quickly we wanted to use a black interviewing team, but the Survey Research Center did not really have enough black interviewers to handle the National Survey of Black Americans. So we created there within the NSBA a traveling training corps. So we would go to different cities that had fallen into the sample, and we would hire and train local black folks who were looking for work, and we would train them to become interviewers on the survey. So being part of that training crew, and I remember I traveled a lot with Wayne McCullough and Shirley Hatchett, and then we would mix and match. And so I guess in the interest of time today, I won't go into the training stories. Well, I'm not going to do that because I actually think there are other stories
that are more
that people can tell in a more entertaining way than my stories that are really funny. But there are lots of things that happen. But just being part of that training crew and going around. I remember going to Atlanta, D.C., New York, and so in those days, just traveling was a big deal for me because I'd never really traveled in a business capacity before. So that was big. The other thing that was huge is somehow, I was able to get it to work out so that the National Survey of Black Americans data were completed and cleaned right at the time that I was ready to write my dissertation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So,
lucky.
yeah, I don't even know how that worked. So I was, this was just like a beautiful setup for me because I was in at the beginning and saw this proposal take place, to actually see a proposal get funded, I would learn later just how difficult that is to actually get something funded. And then to be part of the whole data collection, and then sweating those days when the completed interviews were kind of trickling in, and then they picked up, and then be able to come up with over 2,000 completed interviews was amazing. And then here I am still doing my doctoral stuff and defending my prospectus, which was on the National Survey of Black Americans and focused on Section F.
Right.
And then just writing that dissertation. And sitting there when that day finally came to defend my thesis and looking around the table and seeing Phil Bowman, Jerry Gurin, James Stackson, Joe Veroff. And then I had one guy from the School of Public Health because, don't forget, part of this journey for me was linking even more and more to my public health
What was the person
interest.
from public health?
Jack Kirst, or John P. Kirst, who, by the way, Sherman James, when he was here, was the John P. Kirst Professor of Public Health. Oh. Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting connections. But Jack Kirsch was a guy I met along the way as I realized that, I really wanted to be a psychologist who would transition into public health, because for me, public health was it. So anyway, just being able to write a dissertation, I don't think mine was the first dissertation, but it was one of the first ones to be written on the National Survey of Black Americans, and a lot of us wrote our dissertations on those data back then. So that day was also a great day, not only because I was finally finishing this degree, which, the rest of my family were like, are you ever going to be out of school? And I'm like, I don't know. When are you going to finish? I really don't know. In fact, don't even ask me that question again. I'll let you know. But that day finally came, and in 1982, and I defended, and I was able to, use the NSBA, and then started my postdoc right after that, and all my first papers during that period from '82 to, maybe to the end of the '80s were all focused primarily on either the National Survey of Black Americans data themselves or the conceptual issues that I saw that we had to grapple with as a result of trying to deal with this issue, including that question that Sherman asked way back in, like how do you do this? So
just say, I'm trying to figure out, so since you're there right now, what were some of the kind of contributions you feel like you were able to make to the literature, to the science, to what we knew as a result of your study and participation with the NSBA in those years in the early '80s, late '80s?
Yeah. One was just really being one of the people who really pushed this stress and coping paradigm even more front and center as a way to think about, working with and talking to, studying what's going on with, black folks. So I feel like I was part of that movement. Another one was to help us come to grips with psychopathology, in the sense that it was indeed a legitimate question to try to figure out how to assess mental illness in Black Americans. Because I was always working more on that side of the equation, even though I had these papers that talked about stress and coping. I still was always very interested in the pathological side of things, what I sometimes call is pain, misery, and suffering. Because for me, the fundamental goal was to try to do as much as we could to take as many people as we can out of that pain, misery, and suffering category. And that was going to be done in a couple ways. One, by changing social conditions, because our work and my work clearly show that for a lot of what's troubling you and me are social, contextual, and structural things that are impinging upon us, and that's not right. In fact, it's unjust. But that's only part of the equation. We also have these strengths. So my colleagues, Robert Taylor and Linda Chatters, for example, they're studying strengths of the Black family. They're studying, religion and spirituality as a resource. So all of this fits into this overarching model of stress and coping. And so I was into all of that. And John Henryism, Sherman's contribution, fits in there. Although that has been traditionally linked more to cardiovascular disease, but I think it has lots of implications for, mental health and emotional well-being. But then occasionally, for me personally, it was about what we might call epidemiologic case finding. Can you do it? Can you find the cases of mental disorder in the community.
Right.
You know, let me sum it up this way. For me, this was all about need for help and unmet need in the black community. And because of a whole lot of barriers, structural and personal, the bottom line was that not enough black folks who needed professional help were actually getting professional help. There was too much unmet need for mental health services in black communities. And then it just spins off into 1,000 directions from there. So you can look at it, you know, from the black church perspective and a pastoral counseling perspective. You can look at it that way. You can look at it from a social support standpoint, because my work also showed that even though less than half of the people at the point of a nervous breakdown ever got any professional help for that, at least 9 out of 10 talked to at least one member of their informal social network. So it's not like we're totally alone.
Right.
You know, it's not like you're just out there fending for yourself. Although if you're male, you're a little more likely to be alone, but that's a whole nother conversation. I'd be glad to come back on the next episode and talk to you talk to you about man up, man down.
Absolutely.
You know, so there are a lot of pieces to this puzzle, and you know, I've spent my career, you know, moving around from place to place, depending on what was just enticing me that day, or who I was, you know, collaborating with. But then there was also this, you know, sort of case-finding validity problem. Like, what would be the appropriate methodological approach to interviewing people living in communities and asking them questions such that you could actually classify them as meeting criteria for X disorder or not. And if they do meet criteria for that disorder, and if you feel that that's a reasonably accurate conclusion, then looking at what they are doing to deal with that disorder is just a fundamental basic problem. And more often than not, we were finding, like, say, if I met criteria for major depression, and you asked me, well, so what did you do about it? And I just said, well, you know, I just, hung in there, sat in my house, watched a lot of television, you know, and I just had to man up. That's one way of doing it, and that's kind of a potentially, you know, dangerous way of doing that, because we also know from some of the work that David Williams has done that even though the prevalence of depression is lower for black folks than whites, the severity of the kind of depression some of us have is more serious. You know, so you know, it just raises that question: what's appropriate help-seeking behavior for someone who is in the throes of a pretty painful situation? And so, you know, I've had my days when I've worked on the case-finding end of it, and then I've had my days where I've worked on the diagnostic end of it, because there is a point where psychiatric epidemiology bumps up against clinical psychiatry. So the folks who have, by whatever means, ended up in treatment, are they getting not only the quality of care they deserve, but is the care appropriate, given that the literature shows us that as black men in particular, you and I are at a higher risk of being misclassified, misdiagnosed. You know, we tend to look a little bit more to clinicians like we have psychosis, schizophrenia, even though when we circle back as researchers and, you know, do a more thorough or culturally grounded assessment, more often than not, the black folks who were originally diagnosed with schizophrenia come out with a mood disorder. So sometimes I'm doing a seriously downstream study where we're looking at psychiatric inpatients. And by the way, another name, very important, famous name, just popped into my head: Carl Bell. you know? Like, I mean, I'm sure Carl was on our advisory board, but if he wasn't, we met Carl early on. James and I met him early on. We were in either Toronto or Montreal. I think it was Toronto, at a meeting of the American Psychiatric Association. And I had been reading Carl's work because he was one of the first investigators that I was reading in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, that was trying to get people to say, hey, I think there's some serious misdiagnosing going on with black folks, you know. And he was doing kind of, you know, he's doing case studies. I mean, it just goes to show you how where these hypotheses emerge, you know, from all over the place. And for me, I was always fascinated with the hypotheses and the clinical wisdom that bubbles up out of people who are on the front lines trying to save lives. You know, you talk about the river and people being in the river. You know, when you go downstream, I mean, I'm a public health guy, so we like to talk about working upstream. But I never forget to take a stroll downstream to see who's willing to jump in the water to pull people out. Because to jump in the water, you got to be willing to get wet, which means you better know how to swim. Right. You know, so sometimes I say, you know, some of my public health colleagues, and myself included, I don't swim so well, you know. So you see me upstream, I'm standing back taking notes, you know, and then there's the midstream folks. And so Carl Carl Bell was hugely instrumental in pointing a light on this misdiagnosis issue. So man, there was just like so much happening, and still is. And my biggest problem, you know, if I had it to do all over again, I maybe would have tried to be more narrow in my focus, because I would just be maybe more all over the place than I needed to be. But what are you going to do?
Absolutely.
You know?
I'm trying to think where to go here. So let's talk a little bit about this moment, and I'm happy to have you go on any tangent you want to go on.
Sure.
But let's talk a little bit about this moment where in the late 1990s, early 2000s, somehow, I have no idea how this happened, not to say that it shouldn't have happened, but you become director.
Yeah.
If you could tell a little bit about that story, what made you interested, et cetera, and so forth.
Right, so basically the way it happened was, you know, James was about to make the transition to director
Of ISR.
of ISR. Yeah. And, you know, in our meetings, you know, we occasionally have meetings, he just started, you know, dropping these hints that he was about to make a change. You know how James, you know. And, you know, one thing led to another, and at one point, you know, he asked, you know, would I become the next director once he made his transition. So it was kind of just that simple, but also just that complicated. There's a whole lots of conversations and meetings and memos of all that stuff that had to take place between the School of Public Health and the Institute for Social Research. But, you know, as someone who had grown up in the program, it was just a huge honor for me to be the one, you know, that he approached. And at that stage of my career, I think I was, you know, late 40s, early 50s, you know. And that's a very interesting age to be. You know, I'm 61 now, which is also an interesting age, you know, but it's very different. Like that decade from 50 to 60, I think is just a very significant decade. But I was at that point in my life where I said, well, you know, I really am interested in seeing what the center director life is like. I was already a center director over in the School of Public Health because about 3 years before that, Sherman James had left and gone down to Duke. And while he was here, he started the Center for Research on Ethnicity, Culture, and Health. So when he left, he asked me to be the director of CRECH, or Center for Research on Ethnicity, Culture, and Health, CRECH. So I was already doing some of that, but PRBA was a very different kind of setup, and so I just kind of said yes, and that's how the transition happened.
Do you remember who you first told and maybe what you said to them about this potential opportunity?
Oh, I don't really know, but I'm sure, it was Robert Taylor, Rob Sellers, Linda, Cleo, the usual group. I don't remember, no one stands out as being the first.
Sure.
And for all I know, by that point, by the time it actually happened, maybe the word was out. You know how the grapevine is.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, that's really what happened.
So after you go ahead and decide to become the next director, and did you have a particular vision? Did you have the NSAL in your mind? Did you have a vision for the PRBA and what it was?
I had a vision for PRBA, but not for the NSAL. The NSAL was, James's vision of, in the early days, kind of the replication of the NSBA. In fact, I think in the very beginning it was called the National Survey of African Americans.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And again, you need to check this out to see if
my
memory is correct. And it's also, we probably don't have to. I guess I am going to have to come back for round two, because the more you talk to me, the more I'm going, damn, I need to tell him about this. Locked in to black-white comparative paradigm. So we had a lot of struggles with that. And I'll just say, people just being perplexed. What do you mean a national survey of black folks? Like, what are you going to do with that? Like, how do you even understand what, so it was, so, we don't hear that kind of thing as much today, but in those days, so imagine what it was like to try to get published, when your reviewers are going, what? No white comparison group? What am I supposed to do with this? In fact, I'm hoping somebody has kept some of those old reviews around. That would be fascinating to go back and just look at some of the language. Whereas we fast forward to the National Survey of American Life, which started out as the National Survey of African Americans, it's got a different paradigm, because we have not only African Americans, but we've got Caribbean blacks and a sample of white folks in the NSAL. So that's a conversation.
Okay, so then let's sort of take the NSAL out of it for a second.
Yeah, I'll say that. The NSAL was something that James was working on.
Okay.
Right.
So when you sort of come in as director of the PRBA, what was your vision at the time?
My vision was to try to keep it going as is, which meant funding. And so we had, two big funding streams, the Center for Urban African American Research, Michigan Center, MUCWAR as we call it. And I used to be part of MUCWAR, and then as I got busier and busier, I pulled out of that, but it was in very good hands, James and Robert and Letha, and everybody. And then we always had an African American Mental Health Research Center that was funded by NIMH, and I was always heavily involved in that. And that center and the work we were doing was primarily based in Detroit. And in the original days, we were partnered up with the Detroit Psychiatric Institute, which was housed in the Herman Kiefer Health Complex, in Detroit. So, it's an big old TB hospital that got converted. Now it's closed, but we don't even have time to talk about that. But it eventually became the health department. So we were always doing that kind of work in Detroit. And that was where I was doing some of my inpatient diagnostic stuff. And so one of my key partner was Dr. Cheryl Monday, who, in the 80s was director of psychology at the Detroit Psychiatric Institute, and then later on became a professor of psychology at the University of Detroit Mercy. And she and I are still working together. We work together on numerous projects. So that was my vision, is to basically just keep PRBA moving along with a mental health focus and the Mukwar focus, and then any other proposals that we could work in there. And I did a lot of little different, proposals along the way. That was the vision. And the only, I think, big disappointment for me was that when it came time to re-up for the big mental health center program grants, I tried twice, and neither time was I successful getting funded, So, that's the nature of the game.
Yeah, it's a hard game.
Yeah, and so, that was a little disappointing. But, I was director for all those years, and then, just very briefly, because I don't really want to get into it, but I suffered a serious loss. My daughter passed away in 2010, and that just really knocked me out. And I ended up taking a leave of absence, just from the whole academic game. Yeah. She was a doctoral student in public health, and she was right at the point of writing her dissertation. And so, I took the leave of absence, and I was, didn't know what I was going to do. At one point, I was like, not coming back. I didn't know where I was going to go, but I wasn't coming back. So this comes full circle with what we all know and understand, that the longer you're on the planet and the more situations you have to deal with, sooner or later you are going to have that significant or a series of significant events that might indeed drive you to the point of a nervous breakdown, or stress you out, or overwhelm you, or knock you in the river. So for all those days that I would lecture to my students about being upstream, downstream, midstream, and where do you want to work, it was just so interesting to me that I had never envisioned myself in the water until I was in the water. And then I was like, oh, damn. And so you're there and you're like, I'm trying to stay afloat. And you look up on banks and you're saying, well, who, if anyone's going to jump in to help me get out? And so when I decided to come back to work, I decided that I really no longer wanted to be director of 2 centers, much less didn't want to be director of any centers, that I was going to do something different for the last phase of my career. So since 2012, I've been actually in an interesting reinvention process with my own work, which is essentially now to try to move away from the sort of big, broad social determinants kinds of things to intervention work. So it has taken me a while to get my first intervention study funded, but I do have that now funded, and so I'm in the middle of working on that. As we speak, I'm working on a proposal for the next intervention study, and then I have another proposal that I'm working on with a partner in Detroit that is a support group intervention for Black men with mild to moderate symptoms of depression. So basically, I'm much more downstream. I've always collaborated with clinicians, but all of my clinical collaborations were designed to answer that basic question that Sherman threw out. What's the appropriate methodology for measurement, assessment, classification, diagnosis? Now, I'm actually willing to take on the task of, how would you intervene in a person's life? How would you try to fess up and say, here's the judgment that I'm making. We need to stop doing this and start doing this,
Right, right.
or we need to do more of this. And I know that is a difficult thing to do, and we think we have something that can help with that. And so that's what I'm trying to develop now.
So, so one of the things that I think is interesting is it seems to be that the PRBA, since I've been here, I've heard it referred to as a family. And it seems like at different stages of your career, it's served a kind of family function. So thinking a little bit less professionally, and a little bit more familially, if that's a word.
Right.
So I've heard of, parties used to happen at people's houses and dinner parties.
I have no recollection of any of that. Yeah. I can't remember.
Well, let me ask
I can't remember the 70s.
Absolutely. I probably know why. To what extent does that kind of family element, what role does that family element play in the culture of the PRBA and the success of the PRBA?
Yeah, I actually do remember some of those parties.
Yeah.
And when the camera stopped rolling, I could probably tell you, because I don't want Ryan to hear
all the stuff
about his dad. Yeah, and my son might watch this tape.
Right,
So
sure.
all I can say is that when I first showed up in the 70s, the parties were a lot wilder, and I think in those days people seemed to drink more. I don't drink at all now.
You did it all early.
Yeah, I got it out of the way. But in terms of family stuff, I think for me, when I look back on it, and I don't mean this to sound corny, but the guys I was hanging out with, came to feel like brothers to me. And certainly Wayne McCullough, Robert Taylor, Clarence Wilson, there were a whole bunch of guys. We were all kind of doing the same thing at the same time. And we actually developed a dissertation support group, because we were all just trying to pull each other along. So you can think of that, either as a team or a family. It's probably more like a family because we all kind of hung out with each other, after work, after school. We knew each other's families. I lived right down the sidewalk from, my friend Clarence. Our kids were about the same age. His wife went to dental school. My wife went to dental school. Linda Chatters and I were in the same cohort. And in fact, I think she and I were the first two grad students to be hired on the NSBA. You can probably check that out with her.
Yeah, sure.
Phil Bowman, was really, more like a, big brother. There were just so many people that you could go around to and have these, what I call more significant conversations. Like they weren't superficial, So I'm serious. Like I used to go into Phil's office and like, Phil, I'm trying to work this stuff out. This is serious. And Phil. Phil had a lot to say.
He's always had a lot to say.
Yeah, and in fact, after a while, I'd be like, man, please just let me get out of here, because Phil knows a lot about everything. But he, Jean-Marie Myers, there were so many people around. So that, to me, that's the kind of family aspect. Let me just say one other thing.
Absolutely.
Because I do a lot of lecturing about mentorship as part of my job in public health. And so, having all these guys as mentors, including Jerry Gurin was a great mentor. But James, in those days, was a great mentor. And he used to, because we were doing so much with NIMH, I used to go on a lot of trips with James. He would just, I don't even know why I guess he was just taking me to say, hey, just hang out and you can see how this works. So I do remember doing a tag team presentation in Toronto, and Carl Bell's sitting up there, with a big cowboy hat on, and James could have done that presentation by himself. I remember going to grand rounds with him. I remember more than once going to NIMH and just going in the building and walking around. And so as a grad student, you're thinking NIMH, that's just like this unattainable thing somewhere. No, actually, it's a building that you walk in the front door, and there are hallways, and you can just go in. Because I used to, go around with James, and he'd just be going in talking to people, people we knew, people we didn't know. So he's talking to somebody, I'm talking to somebody. I look back, that's really good mentorship to kind of demystify a lot of this, to break it down. In the early days of some of our work in Detroit, James and I would be barreling down 94. And I remember one time it was snowing like crazy, and we had a flat tire. We had to get out and change that flat tire. So there's just all, I can tell you stories about traveling with him, because he was just a crazy person to travel with.
Sure.
He didn't believe in diminishing the travel drama. It seemed like he wanted to
increase it.
Yeah. So I'd be like, should we be getting on the plane now? Oh no, we got plenty of time. Whatever. I'm just a grad student, I can't, so PRBA as a family, that's what it means. So watching, the young kids, like watching Letha's twins, John and Jeff, who were just running around, acting stupid, grow up to be young men. Watching Phil's two boys, PJ and Dubo. I'd have to say one of the most satisfying experiences I ever had was, watching PJ and Dubo when they were very, very little, just kind of hanging out with them. And then later on, watching both of them come back to school and get master's degrees in the School of Public Health, where I was now tenure track professor, and being able to hire both of them to work with me on my projects was just like crazy. And then doing it later with his daughter, Jamila, when she spent some time here at U of M. And then watching PJ and Dubo become AAU basketball coaches for my son's AAU team, Rashid. And now Rashid is, an engineer out in San Diego, and he's a, budding professional basketball referee. But he was coached by PJ and Dubo, and they were incredible role models because they were both working on doctorates. PJ was getting his MD, and Dubo was eventually to go on to get a PhD in biostatistics. So, I didn't really have to. Rashid knew that I was into education, and he wasn't going to play any sports if he didn't have his books together. But I'm, the old man, but he has seen PJ on TV playing basketball for the University of Illinois. So PJ is his hero, And so when PJ says, hey, we're at this tournament, but now that we're in between games, we're going to go find a classroom and we're going to study. Well, Rashid and Brandon and all the rest of them, they were like, coach says we're going to study, we're going to study. So they just have academics in their blood, and it just came down from Phil to me to PJ, Dubo, Rashid. Now Rashid's doing his thing. So to me, that's kind of a family situation.
So relatedly, one of the stories this little thread that I hear about when I talk to some of the folks around is basketball. So I hear there was a PRBA basketball team. Wasn't there a PRBA basketball team that people played on? I hear that Phil was a ball hog. Did you play on the team? Were you a member of the team, or?
There was a PRBA basketball team. I think I just, pushed that into the deep recesses of my mind. By the way, another group of young people I had forgotten to mention is Ron Brown's two boys.
That's right. And Kahari's around.
Kahari is, they actually, work together at UDM. I've lost track of where Katura is, but I know Katura's doing very well. So I hope you get a chance to interview Ron, because he was hanging out with us. But yeah, I think Ron Brown was the captain of the team.
Okay.
Or he was the organizer. But yeah, Phil was on the team. James was on the team. I was on the team. Rob Taylor, Wayne. I mean, yeah, there was a PRBA team. But the reason I, sort of looked at you funny. I hope you can edit this out. Is, I guess Bill Clinton would say it really depends on what the meaning of team is. So how do you mean team? To me, a team is a cohesive unit where everybody plays a part. So I don't know if we had that kind of a team. I do remember we had a guy on our team named Walt.
Okay.
I think Walt was Phil's cousin.
Okay.
And so all I'll say is, in the course of your investigation,
this is the investigation.
make sure you talk to the team members about our team and Walt.
Okay. What about Walt? What are your suspicions about Walt? What do you think people might say about Walt?
I can tell you exactly what people will say.
Okay.
Walt was very, very good basketball player.
And the rest of you guys?
Well, I won't speak for the others, but I'll tell you, I played basketball up to the 8th grade.
Okay.
And then that was the end of my basketball career.
Okay.
So I was one of these guys who, in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, I grew fast, so I was tall. So I'm looking around at this game called basketball, and I'm like, all I got to learn how to do is hit the boards and get my short jumper together. And I'm going to be, in the NBA, because that's, dribbling, yeah.
Right.
So then it was like I stopped growing, and all these other guys grew. So I ended up, by the time I got to high school, I wasn't tall. I could still rebound pretty well, but I wasn't a big power forward. And I didn't have the dribbling skills to play what probably should have been, my position of an off guard. So I decided it was time for me to concentrate on my football and baseball skills. And basketball, I'd let, So Walt was, again, I don't know all the details. Phil can break this down for you, but Walt, and Phil was very good too, don't get me wrong. But Walt really knew how to score. So what used to fascinate me is how, we might have 45 or 50 points in the game, and Walt's probably scored 40. So, I'm no dummy, so if I ever touched the ball, I'd be like, where's Walt? Where's Walt?
Right.
So.
How did the team do overall? Did you guys?
I don't remember.
Because it was like an intramural.
Yeah, it was intramural. We used to play down at the IM building. I mean, I don't have any trophies, so I don't think we were champions.
Do you feel like there was a overlap? So people, one theory on personality is that it's fairly stable and constant and kind of operates the same all the time in all contexts. Then there's other theories that might say that it changes based on different contexts. Do you think were there things that you learned about your professional colleagues and how to work with them that took place from the basketball court? Or was the basketball team improved by the fact that you had spent time with them professionally? Yeah,
that's an interesting theory. But I think you're overthinking it from my standpoint. The way I look at it is that basketball for the guys our age, that was a central sport, in the black community. So everybody was going to have a basketball experience. Everybody was going to have played. Maybe they played on the high school team, maybe they didn't, but everybody's going to get out there and hoop. And some of us were better than others.
Well, let me say this.
So I don't really, I don't really see it quite that way. We had a team, and it was fun to go out to the gym, and do our thing. But at the end of the day, the best chance we had for winning was to make sure Walt saw the ball,
Sure,
and then after Walt, Phil, because Phil was incredibly fast.
Okay.
Because in practice, I used to try to guard Phil. And
you guys had practices?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And he would just...
pretty serious then.
Yeah, well, you know how we do, But Phil would just go right around me. He was so quick.
So when I think about, corporate executives, they go play golf with each other, and I think about, different types of, in my own perspective, I oftentimes describe the PRBA as a sort of Quilombo, right? Kind of a maroon colony on the university campus, whereby black folks can work together. And you don't always have to explain to your colleagues there about why it's important to study black people, why you need unique things. And it's a relief to be there. But it also seems like basketball as a team sport could have been important for further gelling the team overall. But what you're saying is that not so much so. You're saying that...
No, for me, I really experienced it the other way around.
Okay.
It was all the things we were doing in the academic circle, and then, just a variety of things we were doing sort of informally as families had us gel.
Okay.
So basketball, for me, was not any more or less. It was just part of that mix. We even had for a while, we had a garden out at the county farm.
Huh.
Wow. Yeah. So all of that stuff, I think, sprang out of the fact that we had come together in this PRBA notion, and we all, pretty much liked each other. There were differences, but by and large, we got along fine, and we'd break off in twos and threes, depending on who was doing what. I'm not as big of a basketball guy as I am a baseball guy.
Oh, you're a baseball, okay.
Yeah, but I like Big Ten football, so I can remember, tons of times going to games with Robert and some other folks, and just things like that.
So and again, as anything comes to mind, feel free to just cut and turn and address whatever comes to mind.
I'm actually kind of glancing at the clock.
Okay, what does the clock say? I haven't been looking at mine.
Yeah, I know you've been riveted to this.
Yes.
But I think I probably should start winding down.
Yes,
and if we need to get together again, I'm very happy.
So can we wind down on the theme of the future? It's clear to me you've sort of talked about what niches the PRBA has addressed over the years. But looking into the future, it's a brave new world. There's a lot of different things going on, not only with black folks, but also with research methodologies, things like big data, agent-based, there's all kind of crazy stuff. And then also the funding matrix is interesting. And so, what kind of niches do you see the PRBA filling? What kind of things do you think about when you think about the PRBA in the future? And B, what are some potential collaborators, et cetera, that you might envision the PRBA working with?
Yeah. So that's a tough question and a good question. I have spent some time working with James and Wayne, Robert. We've kind of put together a strategic plan of sorts, and so my take on the first part of your question is that, and this is partially driven by what I'm actually doing now. But I do see this area of translation of findings into intervention and policy realm. I do see that as still a viable future for some components of the PRBA. I understand that not everybody is going to want to do that. And, just speaking for myself, trying to make that transition is very difficult and time consuming. Just the kind of things you have to worry about and deal with when you're doing intervention work as opposed to the broader descriptive kind of thing. But I do see that that is a viable future for the PRBA. In terms of the funding matrix, I think what we're all talking about is diversification. Just trying not to live and die so much on the NIH R01. For me, I've had R01s in my day, but now I am branching out. So the proposal I'm working on right now is in R21. To try to get in a position to get the R01, but R01's in a different category. I'm also working on an R01 as well. So I'm kind of mixing and matching depending on what my track record argues that I can do. But in addition to the R's, I'm spending a lot more time trying to understand foundations. And I do have some foundation money, but it's a very different set of procedures in some of it. And for me, I think I'm probably open to, even additional funding sources. Trying to find that conversation with anyone who thinks I, have a good idea that they're willing to invest in. And I think what that means for me is learning more about how to, merge your research ideas with your interpersonal relationships. It's not about sitting back here in my ivory tower and thinking about the investigator-initiated thing I'm going to send out. I'm still doing that. But, I go to a lot more meetings, functions, lunches, whatever, workshops, and I sort of have my elevator pitch.
Right. Ready to go.
Yeah. And again, try not to be obnoxious with it, but saying, hey, you want to hook up, and I show my passion and excitement for an idea, and that seems to be working. Although I'm still learning how to do that. I would be very interested to hear what my colleagues have to say about their future vision, because I guess I really haven't had that conversation with a lot of them. I've been so locked into trying to survive myself. There's only so many hours in the day, and when I'm not working, which I feel like I'm working all the time, I'm trying to get healthy, as we were talking about before the camera started rolling. And this is a big passion of mine, black men's health.
Right.
I'm not going to get on my soapbox today on that one, but this is a huge problem for us, and I'll just say this, Men's Health Day is right around the corner, and we all should be doing something significant for Men's Health Day. But the problem I see is that hardly anyone I talk to knows about Men's Health Day.
This is the first time I've heard of it.
Yeah, so that tells me, I just barely know about it myself. So that tells me we as men, we are woefully inadequate, and we need to step up our game big time, because we only have ourselves to blame. And it's a shame that I have to turn 60 before I finally kind of get serious with my health lifestyle. And every guy I choose to engage in this conversation has a story about a father or an uncle or a cousin, who's not doing what they need to do. When I was your age, I felt invincible. So I was like, I don't need to worry about this stuff. The reality is we do need to get our act together at all ages. So part of what I'm trying to do is, merge, my interest in, again, trying to help save lives with my research passion. So for me, it's still about black folks, but more and more my projects are about black men, and what are we going to do to step up and take care of ourselves. And so right now the agenda that I'm pushing is not only that demographic, but also lifestyle and behavior. So I'm trying not to completely alienate all of my structural list friends, but yeah, like you, but I'm saying, look, I don't have time to wait for all that. There's a whole lot of stuff we can do here down on the ground, so I may refer to it as personal empowerment. Mm-hmm. But it really is about behavior change. Mm-hmm. And basically, because there are so many people working very hard on structural conditions, I think I can afford the luxury mm-hmm. of saying, well, let me work over here, because we're all on the same team. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it may not feel like it as we get into our little debates, but, those are just kind of academic debates. Mm-hmm. We're all on the same team because we're all working for the same goal. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the things I want to do now won't really take hold unless there's some structural changes. Mm-hmm. But I also know that we could completely, radically transform the structural arrangements, and there'll still be some behavioral things mm-hmm. that we need to work on because there'll be a bunch of guys who ain't doing what they're supposed to do.
Absolutely.
So.